may have verified with me, the 28th annual Gaynor Lecture. So it's pretty amazing. You know, this lecture is made possible thanks to the Rabbi Nathan and Sylvia Gaynor Fund. And it is an amazing partnership with the family. And I won't speak too much. I'm actually going to hand it over to Moses, who will lead the introduction. So Moses, come on up.
You know, I was thinking that last year I remember arriving and my suitcase didn't get here, and so I think I was wearing a t-shirt or something, and there was somebody in the audience who said, you know, the same thing happened to me, and he was wearing shorts. And I talked to him afterwards because I believed him. I thought he had really flown here on from Chicago on Southwest Airlines, and his suitcase didn't arrive just like. But he was really just making it up because he didn't want to change into. I just wonder if he's here tonight. That was you? Well, anyway, welcome to this year's Gaynor Lecture. And as was mentioned, this program has been in existence for a long time. It's dedicated to the memory of our parents, Rabbi Nathan and Sylvia Gaynor, and it's made possible by the Gaynor Fund, which my sister Rena Vessler, who's here tonight, and my other sister Rachel Temple of Overland Park, Kansas, and my brother Jeremy Gaynor of Coral Springs, Florida, established way back in 1992. Our speaker this evening is Rick Richmond. Mr. Richmond is a resident scholar at American Jewish University in Los Angeles, and before the event we had dinner and he explained to me exactly what a resident scholar does. Very interesting. I think I'd like to have a job like that. Anyway, he graduated with honors from Harvard College and New York University Law School and practiced law for more than 30 years. Now, did you graduate from both with honors or just from Harvard? Both. Okay. You put it in sort of he is the author of Racing Against History, the 1940 Campaign for a Jewish Army to Fight Hitler, published in 2018, and the book he will be discussing tonight, And None Shall Make Them Afraid, 8 Stories of the Modern State of Israel, published last year. I actually read the book and I recommend it in any format. He wrote the chapter on Louis Brandeis in a collection of essays entitled What America Owes the Jews, What Jews Owe America in 2016, and he appeared in the documentary film Body and Soul, The State of the Jewish Nation in 2014, and I checked. You can watch this movie via Amazon Prime, even today. It's only a couple of bucks. Mr. Richmond has written for any number of periodicals, including Commentary, the New York Sun, the New York Post, the Jewish Press, Mosaic Magazine, and his own blog, Jewish Current Issues. Do you still do that? Once in a while. I first heard him on Jonathan Tobin's Top Story podcast last year and was immediately intrigued by his new book. And None Shall Make Them Afraid, 8 Stories of the Modern State of Israel was a finalist for the 2023 National Jewish Book Award in Biography. The book is a collection of 8 stories of extraordinary Zionist leaders, 4 born or raised in Europe and 4 born in America. They were instrumental in the establishment of the modern state of Israel, and they were engaged and still are in overcoming the ongoing challenges to Israel's existence in an utterly hostile environment, as we all know, or we should know by now. However, as the reviewer for the New York Sun put it, the book is a, quote, briskly written reminder that giving up on the Jewish state is a bad bet. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the talk, and there will be a dessert reception and book signing. I'm really pleased to introduce to you Rick Richmond.
thank you, Moses, and thank you to the Gaynor family for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I looked at the speakers that spoke in the 27 years before me, and as I said at dinner, I thought seeing my name there was like the answer to an SAT question, which name does not belong on this list. But I know I'm actually on it, not because of myself, but because of the 8 people whose stories I have told in this book. And let me give you briefly how this book evolved, because it ended up in a different place than where it started. It started out, I was just finding stories of interesting individuals involved in Jewish and Zionist history. And I would come home from what a resident scholar does is he resides at HAU and he does scholarly things. What I was doing was research, and researching these stories. I would come up with them, and I'd come home and I'd tell my wife Judy, I said, I can't believe I didn't know this. I got a very good secular education with honors at both schools, and a very good Jewish education, and all this was news to me. How come I didn't know? And the short answer was my teachers didn't know either, and that's why they couldn't teach me. And there's a longer answer I'll give you maybe later on, or we can discuss it in the Q&A. But what I discovered in writing these 8 stories then was that if I put them in chronological order, I would be starting with Theodor Herzl, ending with Ron Dermer. I would have effectively a history of Zionism and the modern state of Israel, told not from 30,000 feet, where people's eyes can glaze over with these stories of history and politics and diplomacy, but all the way down at the bottom with people who devoted their lives to an ideal and an idea, and telling their stories, told and explained the history of Israel in a way that the books I had previously read didn't do it for me. So when I put them together, I had something that was much different than these individual interesting stories. And then, as Moses mentioned, 4 of the people were born or raised in Europe, and 4 were born or raised in the United States. And I then realized that this was a story about the alliance in the 20th century of Zionism and Americanism. Americanism defined the way Professor David Gelernter at Yale defines it as the American civil religion of freedom and democracy. And Zionism was an attempt to establish a free and democratic Jewish state. And so Zionism was in effect Americanism, or the principle of Americanism, working in the world and bringing certain ideals that hadn't been there before into reality. And then after that, I realized I could learn certain things about the nature of Jewish history, certain principles, certain conclusions, a little different than what I had thought they would be or thought they were, if I had thought about it before I started looking at these stories. So I'm going to cover the 8 individuals, and not to worry, I'm not going to cover all of them. We won't be here more than several hours. But these are the 8 individuals, and let me just do 2 sentences about each, and then I'll take 2 of them and tell you a little bit more about their, so maybe 3, a little bit more about their stories and what I think we can learn from them. Okay, Theodor Herzl, I'm sure everybody knows his name, but probably, or not everybody knows, that he wrote The Jewish State, his history-making pamphlet, when he was 35 years old. And then he devoted his life to making that a reality for the next 9 years and died at the age of 44. nobody would have predicted, nobody did predict, that Theodore Herzl, who was the literary editor of the New Free Press, which was a Viennese newspaper, would do this, or could do this, much less that he did this. And his story, we'll go into it a little bit more, is absolutely fascinating. Then Louis Brandeis, everybody knows, everybody's American knows Brandeis's name, but you don't know what he did for Zionism. You probably don't know. Before he became a Supreme Court justice and served for 23 years and became perhaps the best justice in the history of the Supreme Court, but I'm going to try to show you tonight that his effect on history was more from his activities in the American Zionist movement than it was on American law. Just saying quite a lot, right? And it's a story that, who knew? At least I didn't before I started. Chaim Weizmann led the World Zionist Organization for decades, became the first president of Israel, standing next to President Truman days after he recognized the state of Israel. But Chaim Weizmann spent his first 11 years in a shtetl in Russia with a one-room school and one book, the Hebrew Bible. The town was so small, in his autobiography, he called it a townlet. It wasn't even a town. It had no roads, it had no post office. Nobody was going to mail them any letters anyway. They had no newspaper. Lived there for 11 years. And then he's in London. He becomes a professor of chemistry. He's in London.
Why?
In London at the time of the Balfour Declaration, and is influential and probably indispensable. And then 30 years after that, he's standing next to Harry Truman as the first president of Israel. How did that happen? You may have to buy the book or read the book to find out the answer to that one. But Vladimir Jabotinsky, born in Odessa, he grew up, he was a playwright, he was an author, he was a journalist, he was a translator, he was a poet, he became a Zionist leader, he became a soldier, he was instrumental in establishing the Jewish Legion in World War I, and he was the most famous Jewish orator of the first part of the 20th century. He spoke 7 languages. It's an amazing story. Golda Meir, everybody remembers her, the 71-year-old grandmother who became the prime minister. But what you don't probably remember is that although she grew up in Milwaukee and moved to Palestine after World War I, her first 8 years were spent in Russia, in Kyiv, in Ukraine, which was part of Russia at the time. And her father left after one of the pogroms, left a mother and 3 daughters there, came to the United States, moved to Milwaukee to find work as a carpenter, and 3 years later he sends for his wife and his 3 daughters. And imagine that, you're a mother with 3 daughters and you're trying to get out of Russia to get to America in 1906. They have to use border bribes, false identities, begging to get out of the country. They get to the United States, they get to Milwaukee, and her father has got a job, he's a carpenter, he's marching with the workers through the streets of Milwaukee, and there's people on horseback, policemen on horseback around the marchers, and she's amazed. She thinks they're going to beat them. That's what would have happened in Russia. But instead they're protecting them. And so she has seen the most anti-Semitic Tsarist autocracy for her first 8 years. And then the next 10 years, she's living in freedom in America, in Milwaukee, and she moves to Palestine, which is an absolute frontier at the time. Because she wanted to do 2 things, Zionism and socialism. And you could achieve socialism in a small new country in a better way than you could in a big established country. And she made her husband, when he married her, promise. He was a fellow socialist. He was fine. doing socialism in the United States, but she made him promise they would move to Palestine, and he did. This story is an interesting story too. Golda Meir then came back in her 40s, and she was a tremendous strategic asset to Zionism because she spoke unaccented American English. So she could speak to American Jews, and they felt she was one of them. She would speak, banners would be behind her, the first lady of the Jewish people. And Ben Gurion, called her eventually the best man in his cabinet. But she always thought it was humorous that Ben Gurion thought this was the biggest praise he could give her. But his more relevant praise, or more truthful praise was, or less sexist praise at least, was that she was the woman who got the money that made the state. And that's what she did. This is all before, this is years, this is decades before she becomes the grandmother who's the prime minister. Ben Hecht was the most highly paid screenwriter in 1940 in America. He, no connection to the Jewish community, no connection to any synagogue, born on the Lower East Side of New York, but no involvement other than cultural in his Jewish identity. And in the 20s, he becomes a writer. He goes to college, he spends one day at the University of Wisconsin, leaves, goes to Chicago, meets a bunch of writers in Chicago, and he wants to become a writer. He gets a telegram, the most famous telegram in Hollywood history, from Joseph Mankiewicz, who says to him, there's a new industry out here, it's filmmaking, and I can pay you $300 a week if you'll come out and write screenplays. The $300 is peanuts, he says in the telegram, but your only competition out here is idiots. Don't let this get around. So he goes out to Hollywood and he invents the gangster film, which becomes a genre of American cinema. He gets an Oscar at the equivalent of the Oscar at the first Oscar ceremony in 1928 for the best treatment and best original story. And then he does gangster film after gangster film. And he's highly paid, and he, in 1940, he says, I was walking down the street and I bumped into history in the person of Hillel Cook, who was an associate of Jabotinsky, who had come to America to try and help Jabotinsky develop a Jewish army to join the fight against Hitler. Ben Hecht meets him. They have drinks at the 21 Club in New York, the most exclusive club at the time, and Ben Hecht's doing it as a favor. Hillel Cook is 27 years old, Ben Hecht is in his 40s, and this famous guy and this unknown person from Palestine have a conversation that goes all afternoon, and Ben Hecht becomes the most committed one-man multimedia operation to try and save the Jews of Europe and then to establish the state of Israel. And some of his speeches that are in the book jump off the page 80 years later. Just jump off the page. He's underrated as an American writer. And people know some of the things that he did in the 40s, but they don't know the whole story. It's an amazing story. Abba Eban, whom everybody knows, at least probably in our group, is the first representative of the new state of Israel sent to the Security Council 5 days after Israel's declared its independence, because it's being attacked on 3 sides by 5 Arab armies, and somebody's got to go there. He's 33 years old. He's a former professor of Hebrew literature, Arabic literature, and Persian literature at Oxford and Cambridge. That's the guy they sent. He gives a speech in front of the Security Council that makes him instantly worldwide famous. A speech electrifies everybody back in Palestine. It's covered in the New York Times. It's the first of 25 years of speeches, and in the first one they compared his eloquence to Churchill. And you read these speeches and you see why. They're amazing. So this is the raw material of history that you read as you read this. And then Ron Dermer. How many of you know Ron Dermer? One. Ron Dermer is Benjamin Netanyahu's closest associate over the last 15 years. He's got an interesting story that I will tell you a little bit later on. But everybody says to me, particularly those who don't like Netanyahu, what is Ron Dermer doing in this book? You've got 7 people, lived full lives, affected history, and Ron Dermer. I'm going to answer that question, but you're going to have to stay for the whole lecture in order to get the answer. Okay. So with these 8 individuals, just quickly, what I also noticed is from a different city in every instance, from 4 different countries, 8 cities, 4 countries, 3 continents. And what an incredible fact that is, that these people who were instrumental in creating a Jewish state were from all over the world and basically didn't even know each other. Weizmann and Jabotinsky knew each other. They both were in the United States in 1940 as part of the effort to form a Jewish army. But they weren't speaking to each other. And by not speaking to each other, I don't mean they weren't coordinating with each other. They weren't on speaking terms. And neither of the two were at that point were on speaking terms with Ben Gurion. So you have this small people under existential attack with 3 leaders who aren't even talking to each other. That's probably a quintessential Jewish story, but that's an amazing, amazing story. And then, as Moses and I've said before, you've got 4 who were born or raised in Europe and 4 who were born and raised in America. And all of a sudden I realized this story is much bigger than these individuals. It is a story of an American Zionist coalition that achieved amazing things. So let's cover Theodor Herzl. Born in 1860, it's a great time for Jews. Jews are emancipated in Hungary, where he's born in Budapest and moves to Vienna. It's the center of Jewish life. By law, Jews have been emancipated. Professions are open to them. He goes to law school, he becomes a journalist, and then he's the literary editor in 1895. He authors the pamphlet, The Jewish State, and he organizes 6 congresses, and then he negotiates with kings, princes, ministers, the Sultan, and the Pope, and then he dies suddenly in 1904 at age 44. And people think, they look at me, he had a world-class beard. He was 6 feet tall, which was very tall at the time for someone who was Jewish. People always talk about his piercing eyes. He had a certain personal charisma, but that's not the reason. And people think, well, okay, somebody comes up with the idea, how about a Jewish state? They think, okay, that's good. Guy seems persuasive, let's do it. That's not how it happened. Herzl not only had the real world in opposition to him, but Jewish opposition to Herzl was across the board. The Orthodox rabbis thought he was rushing the end. We were supposed to wait for the Messiah for a Jewish state. If you tried to do it sooner than that, it was literally sacrilegious. And at the other religious spectrum, Reform rabbis thought, we want to be a modern, rational religion. We don't want all that old stuff, those rituals. They were for ancient times, not for us. And therefore, we're not interested in recreating a Jewish state. We're interested in being a modern religion like our Christian brothers. They opposed him. Then the Jewish philanthropists who had spent millions on charity thought, we're having a tough time just being charitable here, having to say Jews, you're going to do a Jewish state, it's ridiculous. Then the socialist Jews, of whom there were many at the time, thought any kind of nationalism was reactionary, counter-revolutionary, exactly the opposite of what they wanted, which was an international movement of class, the labor classes across country lines. They did not want a Jewish state. It was the opposite of what they wanted. Then assimilated Jews were afraid of being accused of dual loyalty. Right after they had acquired freedom and equal status. All of a sudden, they're pushing for a Jewish state. What is going to happen? They're going to be accused of dual loyalty. They want nothing to do with it. And finally, the Jewish public leaders who just thought the whole idea was ridiculous. It was absurd. It was crazy. People thought he was literally crazy, some. And he had no institutional support. He had no financial support beyond his own resources, which he spent, including his wife's dowry, which was significant. His wife came from an upper middle class family, spent it all on Zionism, and died a poor man. And his wife, at 84, his wife dies at age 39. 4 years later, his family is supported by the movement. They had to be. He didn't have any money. And his children, one committed suicide, one was killed during the Holocaust, another, forget exactly what happened to her, but his family's gone. There's no Herzl today. And this is what he did in 9 years. And we don't know the story. We didn't, the story's amazing. It's just amazing what he did. This is the picture of the first Zionist Congress in 1897. A year and a half after he publishes this long pamphlet about the Jewish state, which most people think is crazy, he got a crowd to show up in Switzerland. It was in Basel, Switzerland, which, if you know the map, is way out of the way. It was supposed to be in Munich, which was a center of Jewish life. They had lots of shuls, lots of kosher restaurants, and that's where he planned it. And at the last moment, the Jewish establishment said, we don't want it here. It'll just make trouble. And he had to move it to Basel, Switzerland at the last moment. And you can see, well, maybe you can't quite see, but they're all dressed in tuxedos, in formal wear, because he wanted them to dress up. He wanted them to think of themselves as the first assembly of the Jewish people. Telegraphs and photography were the newest thing in journalism. He wanted pictures flashed, telegraphed across the world. He was a playwright and a journalist. He knew how to put on a drama, and he knew how to write it up, and he knew how to get the media of the day to cover it, and that's what he did. And the other thing you probably notice is you don't see a lot of women there in that picture. You probably can't spot any. But there were women there. There were about 15 delegates who were women. And I just briefly want to tell you the story of one of them because it's so fascinating. One of the Americans, there were 5 Americans. One of them was a woman by the name of Rosa Sonnenschein. She was a Rebbitzin who had been married in St. Louis, but she moved to Chicago after she was divorced. She started the first American magazine for Jewish women in America called the American Jewess. You can read, it's online, the archives are online, you can go back and look at it. She goes to this. Imagine what it took to get from Chicago to New York. That's a trip, right? We're before planes. Then you got to get on a ship and get across the Atlantic. And then you got to go across a continent. And then you got to go down to Basel, Switzerland. And that's what she did. And then went home and wrote it up. And you can look in the archives, as I did, and there's her summary of what happened. And she said, everybody who's here today is going to remember that they were here. Something big is happening here. And but she was upset about one thing, which was the women delegates could not vote. So she went up to Herzl and she said, you got to have the women vote. And Herzl said, I will do that at the next conference, and he did. And you think, well, okay, it's male chauvinism, and so he did it. Good for him. But it took 20 years later before women had the vote in the United States. So 20 years before women got the vote in America, Herzl is giving the vote to women as well as men. Zionism was a progressive movement, an attempt really to save classical liberalism from anti-Semitism in Europe and enable the Jews to move to a land where they could practice it in a liberal fashion themselves. Okay, the first Zionist Congress. And some of these phrases you'll see maybe have some echoes even in our own time, 130 years later. Herzl says that this era, which is so sublime, and it was a sublime era because of electricity. People thought electricity was the Messiah. Literally thought that was the Messiah. We're going to be able to do all these things with electricity. But it was also because of emancipation, and every era thinks it's the smartest human era ever, and they did in the last part of the 19th century. We feel ourselves everywhere surrounded by the old hatred. The first reaction was surprise, which then changed to pain and anger. We have been so frequently and fiercely reproached for a feeling of group solidarity, but we all of a sudden were attacked out of the blue to them by anti-Semitism. We have, he said, come home, so to speak, come home. Zionism means a returning home to Jewish identity before the return to the country of the Jews. He didn't want simply a state. He wanted the Jewish people to be the Jewish people, and the state was necessary for that, but he first wanted them to return to their Jewish identity. And in the same speech, he says, in this Congress, we are creating for the Jewish people an agency they have not hitherto possessed, but which it has needed most urgently for its survival. And our Congress will live on eternally, restoring to all Jews their dignity and making them worthy of a history whose glory, if perhaps now faded, is nonetheless imperishable. About 5 years ago, they published in English for the first time the entire transcript of that first Zionist conference, so you can go read it. And in the notes, after his speech, which is a beautiful speech, they say there was 15 minutes of applause. It's like the Republican or Democratic convention where they all march around, for 15 minutes. And back then, what you did to really indicate your agreement with the speaker was you took your cane and you pounded on the floor. 15 minutes of that. That's the kind of reaction. And Herzl's insight, I think this was at the fourth Zionist Congress in 1900, where, and this is an example of both his lyrical writing and also an incredible idea he had. Our reappearance in the land of our fathers, prophesied by Holy Writ, sung by our poets, yearned for amidst tears by our stricken nation, and jeered at by miserable scoffers. That return is a matter of political moment to the powers that have interests in Asia. What's interesting about this is he's talking about the land of our fathers, the return. He's talking about the reappearance. And that last phrase, a matter of political moment to the powers, was his realization that if you wanted to have peace in the Middle East, the Near East as it was then called, you needed a Jewish state. Why? Because otherwise you have the German Empire and the Russian Empire and the British Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire fighting each other because it was a strategic area of the world. The pathway to India, the pathway to the Suez Canal. The only people who could have political sovereignty there that wouldn't upset necessarily any of the empires that were ruling the world was the Jewish state. And he went around talking to princes and sultans and popes and telling them that give the Jews a chance to live there. It won't be a threat to your empire. And that was an incredible insight, because before that, Zionism was an intellectual discussion or a charitable discussion or a discussion about the poor Jews, and it wasn't a terrible, don't we need to do something? He converted it into something that sent him literally into the offices of the highest people in all the empires of the world, the Western world at least at that time, to talk about Zionism. Okay, but he not only had opposition within the Jewish people, from Orthodox to Reform, but within the Zionist movement, the people who were for what he was trying to do. And this is from his private diary, never published during his lifetime, June 1st, 1901. And this was at a time when he was getting hit by left and right as to what he was trying to do. You needed to go to Palestine. You couldn't go to Palestine. Let's think of somewhere else. And he says he's writing almost in despair in his diary, and he's saying perhaps a fair-minded historian will find that it was, after all, something that a Jewish journalist without means, in the midst of the deepest degradation of the Jewish people, in a time of the most sickening anti-Semitism, was able to create a flag out of ragcloth and a nation out of the foundry rabble, a nation that flocked to this flag with straightened backs. He's just writing to himself. And he's writing in despair because he's been talking to all these people. And the Jews are, most of the Jews don't support Zionism at the time. Those who do, they have different ideas than he does. He hasn't been successful 5 years of effort. It's not clear he's going to be successful because the Ottoman Empire rules the Middle East, and they've made it clear to him that they're not going to support a Jewish state there. And he writes this in his diary, but look what happens 40 years later. There's his flag, the flag that he said was so important. You need to have a flag, he said, because people will die for a flag. You've got to have it. So he develops that flag, which is like a tallit. You've got the white area, which is a new start for the Jewish people, and you've got the Star of David. You've got the stripes there, which make it look like a tallit. That's the flag he and one other person developed. And there's his picture. That's Ben Gurion reading the Declaration of Independence in 1948. And that's what Herzl, who in 1901 was writing his diary about how it didn't look like it was going to happen, but maybe a historian will write that it was something what he did. That's what happened. Okay, that's maybe Herzl's story. Let's go to Brandeis. Brandeis, this is a picture of Brandeis in 1937. He looks like a prophet from the Hebrew Bible, right? His letters from Roosevelt to Brandeis started, they were personal friends. The private letters to him started, "Dear Isaiah." That's what he called Brandeis. He was born in Kentucky in 1856, in Kentucky. His parents had come from Prague after the failure of the 1848 revolutions. They wanted nothing to do with Jewish history. The people who were coming there were trying to escape history, not remember it. No bar mitzvah, no membership in a shul, never celebrated Jewish holidays, nothing. Goes to Harvard Law School, he graduates with the highest grades in the history of the school. He graduates in 2 years. Didn't go to college, just went straight to Harvard Law School. Age 20, highest grades in the school's history, and he became famous as the people's attorney. The one who invented pro bono law, took on the pro bono cases. That's how he became famous. Nominated to the Supreme Court in 1916 by Woodrow Wilson, first Jewish nominee to the Supreme Court in U.S. history. Previous to that, no hearings on nominees. The president sent a letter to the Congress and said, "Here's the guy I want." And it's not to say that Congress just approved it. There were a lot of nominees who they didn't approve, but they didn't hold hearings. For Brandeis, they held 4 months of hearings. They had 7 former presidents of the American Bar Association say this guy's too radical for the court. But Wilson stood by him, and he served on the court for 23 years. But as I say, that it's not when he was an acknowledged prophet that I think he affected history. It's back when he was a younger man in 1914. Because although he was maybe perhaps the greatest Supreme Court justice, his opinions, one of his biographers said, is like constitutional poetry. One of his opinions, he wrote to model Pericles' funeral oration. And that's the type of effort he put into his opinions. But he's one judge, and yes, those ideas are at one justice. Those ideas are out there, but it takes a bunch of other justices and time and whatever. So although he's very important in American judicial history, I think what he did for American Zionism, and therefore Zionism in general, was more important. And this is the type of evolution that he came from. 1905, it's the 250th anniversary of the arrival of Jews in America. He gives us a major speech called What Loyalty Demands. And he says American public life has no place for what President Roosevelt has called hyphenated Americans, by which he meant German Americans, Russian Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, and he says Jewish Americans. No place. Habits of living or of thought tend to keep alive difference of origin or to classify men according to their religious beliefs are inconsistent with the American ideal of brotherhood and are disloyal. That's where he was in 1905. He's in his 50s, right? But a decade later, he gives a speech called The Duty of Educated Jews in America. And he says, and this is his most famous Zionist quote, gradually it became clear to me that to be good Americans, we must be better Jews. And to be better Jews, we must become Zionists. And how did Brandeis, who had no connection, it's another kind of miracle story. Herzl comes out of nowhere, 9 years. The next 9 years he does what he does. Brandeis, it's a little hard to tell exactly, one can't be certain, because Brandeis didn't write a lot of personal letters. I've looked through it, I haven't read them all, but I've looked through his letters to his family, trying to find out what happened. And he doesn't even tell his family. You can piece it together, and I believe, it's not my theory alone, but I've read the source documents, and I believe it's right, that what happened was he met Jacob de Haas. Jacob de Haas was Herzl's lieutenant for the United States, for Britain. And Herzl told him, you speak English, move to the United States, it's where we need somebody. So he moves to the United States, Herzl dies, Jacob de Haas gets involved in the American Jewish movement, and he's got a newspaper in Boston that he publishes, and he wants to go interview Brandeis about insurance law reform. He knows Brandeis is interested in reform of insurance law. He gets an interview with them, and they start talking about Herzl. And Jacob de Haas knows, and Brandeis doesn't. And they spend the whole afternoon, and Brandeis spends the summer researching it. And more than anything else, that's what did it. This incredible happenstance goes across the ocean and gets the smartest lawyer in the United States. And the reason I say it was more of a historical impact is that at the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when Weitzman was in London talking to Balfour and Lloyd George, Brandeis was in the United States, and he was a personal friend of Woodrow Wilson. More than anyone else, Brandeis had been responsible for Wilson becoming president, because Brandeis was the most famous progressive. He was Republican. He was progressive, like Teddy Roosevelt. And he endorsed Wilson, who was a Democrat, because he was a progressive. And that endorsement covered the front page by the New York Times. Many people think it's what elected Woodrow Wilson. So he was very well respected and regarded by Wilson. He was able to talk to Wilson about Zionism, and Wilson eventually supported the Balfour Declaration, and Weitzman and others wrote that if Wilson hadn't done that, the British may not have issued the Balfour Declaration. So this guy grows up in Kentucky, and this happens. How does that happen? We'll come to Jewish history principles a little bit later. But Brandeis does that, Herzl does that, and 30 years later, there's Chaim Weitzman standing as president of the state of Israel next to Harry Truman. And he's giving him a small Torah. You can see it there. It's a Torah that was written for a kid's bar mitzvah in 1940, given to a Jewish chaplain who used it in Europe all during World War II. was a historic Torah. And Weitzman is presenting it to Truman to thank him for a week before. He just recognized the state of Israel. Truman takes it and he says, "Thank you. I've always wanted one of those." But that guy standing to Truman's left was in a shtetl for his first 11 years, and there he is. Okay, so that's Brandeis and Herzl. Then let me jump all the way to Ron Dermer. Ron Dermer, born in Miami Beach. His father was the mayor of Miami Beach. His brother was the mayor twice of Miami Beach. He goes to the University of Pennsylvania, goes to the Wharton School, gets a degree there. He's going to go through a graduate degree at Oxford and Cambridge. He has no involvement with Zionism. He meets Natan Sharansky. And Sharansky's starting a new party in Israel for Russian immigrants. And Dermer helps him out. And he goes to Israel and he sees those things and he becomes enamored of what Israel is doing and what it represents. He and Sharansky would later write a book called The Case for Democracy. And eventually, Dermer becomes the ambassador. Let's go there. This is the official Israeli announcement in 2013 of him becoming ambassador. And this is the official Israeli picture that's in the announcement. They're not wearing a tie. They're just sitting there together, looking at a computer. You go into the Israeli embassy after he's nominated and comes to the United States to serve. That's Ron Dermer, but in Israel, it's Ron Dermer. But he becomes Netanyahu's closest associate. And the reason, the story that I tell in the book is about the speech that Netanyahu gave in front of the Congress in 2015 that was so controversial because Obama opposed it, 60 Democrats boycotted it. Dermer, pretty clear, he wrote it. It's the literary and historical allusions in that speech are unbelievable. And the story about how it came about and how it was written and how it was delivered is. But the real reason that Dermer is in the book is because I want to tell the story of why he renounced his U.S. citizenship. You have to renounce your U.S. citizenship if you want to be a foreign diplomat. If you want to be a diplomat in a foreign country, you can't be in America with constitutional rights against search and seizure and free speech and all that sort of thing. You just can't. So the law provides, if you want to be an ambassador here in the United States, you can't be a U.S. citizen. So he's got to give up his U.S. citizenship in order to do it. And this is the form, Department of State Form 4080. It's one where you renounce your U.S. citizenship. It's one page. There's a lot of white space on that page. They want you to know what you are doing. They're not legal language up there. There's a little bit of legal language, but it's not, anybody can understand it, and they want you to know you're giving up something you can't get back. You better be sure. It's very valuable. If you're sure, sign this statement. So he does, just like what Michael Oren did as well. But what Dermer did that was unusual, and what I read, and why I wanted to write a chapter with him that grew into more than just this story, but the reason I wanted to write about him was that so people could read the essay that Dermer wrote and attaches to this one-page form. The essay is called Proud to Have Been an American. And this was at a time when people, after the Gulf War, knew the song Proud to Be an American. His essay was entitled Proud to Have Been an American. It was explaining why he gave up his citizenship. For 33 years, I have felt America's warm embrace, and I'm eternally grateful for it. I was born in America, raised in America, formed in America. I've been educated by the wisdom of its founders, inspired by the words of its leaders, protected by the sacrifices of its soldiers. And in the paragraph I didn't have enough space for up there, he says, when I think of freedom, I think of Lincoln. When I think of courage, I think of Normandy. When I think of justice, I think of Martin Luther King Jr. I left America because America has shown me the power of freedom to change the lives of individuals, of nations, and of the world. I left America because I wanted to help another nation I love defend the freedoms that Americans have long taken for granted. In serving the state of Israel and working to secure our common future, I will champion those ideals all my life. And to me, this was the most beautiful classical statement of the alliance of Zionism and Americanism in the world. And I don't know if students still memorize the Gettysburg Address, but they ought to write. All American Jewish students, I think, ought to know this Dermer essay. Okay, let me, before we go to questions, come to the lessons of Jewish history. The first one is, everybody asked me when I was writing the book, and even when I was first presenting it, they said, well, doesn't this support the great man theory of history? Great man, great woman theory of history, which is the theory from the 19th century that history is the biography of extraordinary individuals writ large. And I thought, no, actually, it's the opposite. This proves the theory of the small individual theory of history. All these people, most of whom you know as major historical figures, weren't that when they started. They were just unknown individuals who devoted their lives to an idea and an ideal, and they helped change the world. But not because they were great men or great women. It was because of what they did, not because of their status or the books that they read. So I think it actually refutes the great man. None of these people were kings or presidents or things like that. They had no army. They had no political elected power. They were individuals, and they did this. Secondly, that words are as important as weapons. When Abba Eban gave his first speech to the Security Council of the UN, what the New York Times said about it was that he had justified his cause in a way that was even more important than the military action he was defending. And certainly his later speeches did that as well. So you have to be able to articulate your cause in order to inspire people. You may write to your diary that I hope somebody says I did something, but it's what you did, what you said, what Herzl said at Congress that inspired people. And it wasn't because he was a great man. He was a journalist, he was a playwright, because of what he said. It's the words. The same thing with Brandeis, same thing with Jabotinsky, everybody on this list. And so I conclude that Jewish history is in effect an invisible baton, passed from generation to generation, across countries, over oceans, to each individual. It's something that can be picked up literally by anyone. And so near the end of the book, I end with a quote from Louis Brandeis: "We are the trustees, each of us, of Jewish history, charged to carry forward what others in the past have borne so well." And so it's important to know all of this history because it's part of who we are. And if we forget it, or worse yet, don't even know it, then we're going to lose it. And one of my other favorite quotations is one by David McCullough of John Adams and other books about the American founders. And he said, we have to value what our forebears did for us, or we're not going to take it very seriously, and it can slip away. If you inherited some great work of art that is worth a fortune, and you don't know that it's worth a fortune, and you don't even know that it's a great work of art, you're not going to be interested in it, and you're going to lose it. And this is a problem of American history, I would say as well, that our kids, our younger generation, don't know American history other than the country was formed by dead white men who owned slaves. They don't know the ideas, they don't know the experiences, they don't know the individual stories. And that's a problem, in my opinion, for us as a country. And so I'll end with a quotation from Roger Scruton, who is actually a British philosopher, who said, "We do not merely study the past, we inherit it. And the inheritance brings with it not only the rights of ownership, but the duties of trusteeship." That's what Brandon said. "Things fought for and died for should not be idly squandered, for they are the property of others who are not yet born." So I started out with this book, thinking about individuals. Come home and ask my wife, how come I didn't know about this? Started writing it up. And all of a sudden it turned into what's effectively a history of the last 120 years of Jewish history, something that can teach us all about what we've inherited, and my attempt to try and pass it on. So. Questions?
Yeah.
Anyone has questions? There.
With all the different personalities and the background, was there a question of what Palestine should look like once it becomes Israel?
That's a great question. In 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, and in 1922, 5 years later, when the League of Nations adopted the mandate for Palestine and gave it to the British, Palestine was not just the area west of the Jordan River, but an equally large area east of the Jordan River in what is today Jordan. And actually 2.5 of the 12 tribes of Israel lived on the east bank of the Jordan River. They didn't cross over with Joshua. They got permission to stay behind, and that's where they stayed. So Palestine was generally understood to be all of the area west of the Jordan River, plus an equally large area east of the Jordan River. From virtually the beginning, the Jews said, we know there are other people there, and Arabs. They will have a place in our state. But we also don't want all of historical Palestine. We want just enough to have a Jewish state. So Weizmann at the Peace Conference in 1919 presented, I don't know if he presented a map, but the area that they claimed, the Zionists claimed, was all of Palestine west of the Jordan River, and a thin sliver on the east bank, which was valuable agricultural land, all of it historically Eretz Israel, and leaving a very large area of Palestine to the Arabs, which then became Transjordan, which then became Jordan. So that effectively there was a two-state solution from the very beginning. And what we're arguing about these days, was, well, how about the other half? Let's split that too. But that was what was understood as the area of Palestine. In 1947, when the UN adopted its two-state recommendation, it was just the area west of the Jordan, because Jordan existed, and it was split almost evenly between a state of Israel and a Palestinian state. The Jews accepted it. The Arabs did not. War occurred. Ever since, there's been war after war.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I'm still curious that Ron Dremer made it to this list. So a couple questions. One, what do you see his major contribution to the state of Israel to bring him to the level of the other 7? And the second question is, did you have any other front runners that did not make it to the final cut of the book?
Okay. On the first question, you're absolutely right. He does not deserve to be on this list because of his accomplishments. He was a very good ambassador. There were lots of very good ambassadors. He's not a historic figure. He's on there, as I say, and I wanted people to read it. But the real reason, or the broader reason at least, is that he illustrates the Jewish history, in my mind, the Jewish history is a baton that's passed on to be picked up by anyone. Anyone. You don't have to be a great man of history. You don't have to be a figure of consequence. You don't have to be known by the public. You just have to pick up the baton that 2 millennia or 3 millennia of history have given you, but certainly 100 years of Zionist history has given you, and that's what he did. So his essay illustrated why he did it. That's why he's there. He's not there to say he's the 8th. Okay, in terms of people who didn't make the list, what I wanted to do if I had time, I wanted to do something about the spouses of these people, including Morris Meyerson, who was Golda Meir's spouse. Sacrifices he made were heartbreaking. And Golda's still very popular in the United States, very unpopular in Israel because of the Yom Kippur War. My person Vintage is one of the great women of history, but that, as it relates to this, she was not a great mother, she was not a great wife by any means. Morris Meyerson, who didn't want to go with her, becomes the person who enables her to be who she was in terms of doing what she did. And the same thing with the other spouses. Vera Weissman was a medical doctor, an accomplished person. In the beginning of the 20th century, a woman from Russia as a medical doctor was an incredible achievement, number one. And number two, she did things to enable Weissman to go traipse around making his Zionist speeches that he wouldn't have been able to do. Same thing with Joanna Jabotinsky and Paula Ben-Gurion. The story, this may be apocryphal, but if you know about Paula Ben-Gurion, this could have happened. The story is that they're retired. They're in the kibbutz. Ben-Gurion is no longer the prime minister, and they're sitting there reading their respective books. And Ben-Gurion is reading the history of the Jewish people. And he puts down the book and he says to Paula, "Do you know how many truly great leaders of the Jewish people there have been in all of history?" And she says, "Yes, I do." He says, "You do?" She says, "Yes, I do." He says, "Well, okay, how many?" And she says, "One less than you think." And that was Paul. And she had no profession. She was taking care of the kids. Ben-Gurion was gone for 9 months during 1940, doing great things, trying to establish a Jewish army to fight Hitler. But Paula was essential to that story. So if I could have, I would have liked to have done that. But these are not this is a good point, or an important place to note. These are not the 8. Ben-Gurion's not on this list. It's not political because Menachem Begin's not on the list either. I knew people knew who Ben-Gurion was. They didn't need me to go tell them stories. And Menachem Begin is famous justly as well. So you had one on the right, one on the left. It was not a political decision. It was that people knew about them. They don't need to hear from Rick Richard about them. But these stories, which I found and thought so fascinating, I thought I could pass on.
So a current event, what's the relationship with Derma and Bibi today?
Dermer's position today is he is the Minister of Strategic Affairs, which when he was appointed, when Bibi became Prime Minister again, which was 2022, first part of 2022, what that meant was take care of Iran. You're in charge of Iran. And that was his portfolio, because that was the issue. The nuclear program was what Bibi put as the first three of his objectives: stop the Iranian nuclear program, and he put his most trusted aide in that position. And so he's there, and he's still very close to Netanyahu. He reportedly has told Netanyahu that he made a mistake by not being more public about what was going on during these last 7 months in the Gaza war, that somebody needed to articulate in words the Israeli cause, and Dermer wanted him to do that, and reportedly Bibi didn't. Don't know what's going on with Bibi. Some people think there's something going on with his health, but he's that close that he would go to the prime minister and say, this is what you've got to do. So whenever you see a picture of an Israeli cabinet meeting or a meeting with American officials or Arab officials, if you see Dermer in that picture, you know it's a serious meeting, because Dermer being there means he's representing the prime minister of Israel. And not officially, he's the guy. And if you say something to him, it can go to the prime minister. And if he's not there, it's just another meeting with the State Department or whatever. So he's still very, very close and very, very important within the government.
So what's your next project?
My next what?
Project. What are you going to be doing after this?
Oh.
Dinner?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm thinking. I don't know if I'm the right guy to do it, but you know the Yale University series Jewish Lives, or there's a whole set of political, social, cultural, like 50 books. There's one on Jabotinsky, one on Ben Gurion, one on Menachem Begin, one on Yitzhak Rabin, 5 others, not Chaim Weizmann, and which is a shanda. And there ought to be, because people ought to know what he did. It's just an amazing story. And he's sort of historically caught between Herzl, the great man, if there were one, and Ben Gurion, and the father of his country. Well, Weizmann holds an equal claim to being a parent of his country as both Herzl and Ben Gurion. And there ought to be a book. There ought to be a book in that series. It's amazing that there isn't. So I don't know. I'm a little tired, but if I were going to do one, that would probably be it.
Thank you.
There's obviously a lot of research that goes on in putting this whole thing together. Could you talk a little bit about how you do the research, the research process, and then ultimately there must be a lot of stuff that's like on the cutting floor. Can you talk about how you decide what goes there, and like what percentage of that work that you do never really makes it?
Okay, so in terms of research, American Jewish University has a world-class library, and I was responsible the year I wrote the book for having checked out more than half of the books that were checked out that year. But the real way I was able to do the research was first the internet. Surprising amount of stuff on the internet, like Rosa Sonnenschein's diary from 1897. I could read the whole thing, and I didn't trust secondary accounts. Neither should you. Well, why should if I tell you something, well, why should you believe it? But if I quote something and quote something else and something else, then maybe you can see the dots that I'm connecting and decide for yourself whether I'm right or not. And what I would do is, through Amazon, I couldn't have written the book without Amazon, I could get diaries and memoirs and books of letters and things that were written at the time for $1 or $2 plus $4 in shipping. And so my next project really ought to be to start a shipping and handling company so I can really make some money from the book business. But so I could get, I got several hundred books for $6 each, and they were priceless from my standpoint because of that. I didn't have to rely on a secondary authority. I could see the actual raw material of history and draw some conclusions. And there's a lot of block quotes in the book. The reason is I want you guys to see it. And I have 100 pages of footnotes. And the reason is I want you guys to see where I got it from. And there's more quotes that I didn't want to slow down the story, but I wanted it there for everybody to read. And I have to give a shout out to my publisher, Encounter Books, who was willing to publish 100 pages of footnotes because I had a friend who wrote, a famous guy, many more books than I've written, which is 2. And his book about his time as an ambassador, the Jewish book, and his publisher refused to publish the footnotes. Too expensive publishing all those footnotes. We'll put it on the internet. If somebody wants to go look at your footnotes, they can look at the internet. Well, nobody's ever going to do that, right? But I, through this publisher, being willing to do this, if you read the book, you'll see, you start going to the footnotes, you'll see, it's not just me, you'll see where I got it, and you'll see more stuff that I didn't put in the story so that the story would flow, but is important stuff if you really want to see the whole story. So that's the way I researched it. I had great assistance from the library, and I had the internet, and I had Amazon.
We have time for one more question.
If no one else wants to ask us a second. Thank you. So right after Israel declared independence, and what was it like in the United States for Christians, for non-Jews, and for Jews? What was the reaction from both groups?
What period of time are you talking about?
Right after they declared in 48, yeah.
They were generally, the non-Jews were generally supportive. People in the State Department and the Pentagon thought Truman was an idiot. And the CIA released reports in the Jewish state the last 2 years. We'll have to send troops if we want to support it, so don't even think about doing it. You're going to piss off the Arabs and it's not going to work. That was the official at that level, but the public supported it. The really interesting question is, what did the Jews think about it? Because one of the things I found that I had never seen even referenced in secondary authorities was a memo that the British consul, the British embassy in Washington prepared in 1946, 1 year after World War II ended. The Holocaust is done, the war is done. It's a memo, confidential, back to London, state of Jewish opinion in the United States. And they say the Jews are scared. They saw what happened to their people. They saw what happened in the United States with Lindbergh, Father Coughlin, and everybody else, and they think it can happen here. And they are demoralized by losing 6 million people and no prospect in 1946 of a Jewish state. And one of the miracles of the Jewish state is not simply that it was recreated after 2,000 years, not simply that these individuals did what they did and groups came together and they did it. It transformed American Jewry, because as the state survived and succeeded, American Jews became proud of what had been done, and it changed their thinking. So you look at what, and this was a private memo, lengthy memo by the British ambassador, no reason to lie or anything like that. I thought it was that act could be trusted as an accurate portrayal of the psychology of American Jews, which got transformed by the state of Israel.
Thank you, Rick. Rick will be in the lobby signing books if you want to purchase the book. We also have dessert reception out there. We hope you'll join us and hang out and kibitz some more. So thank you for coming tonight to the Gaynor Lecture.